The Indonesian War of Independence from 1945 to 1949 is an often forgotten conflict. For decades, the horrors of this bloody anti-colonial war were swept under the rug by the Dutch government, and it was only in March 2020 that they officially recognized and apologized for the terror with which they had ruled over tens of millions of Indonesians from the mid-19th century until 1949. But this conflict is the very beginning of post-World War II decolonization, and also one of the first places where the Western powers face off with the post-war communist surge. It sets the US and the European powers on a path of ambiguity and confusion as they start a series of wars to arguably defend democracy, but that will also see them wage bloody war on peoples simply seeking their own freedom. Welcome to the Indonesian War of Independence, a Time Ghost miniseries that follows that struggle year by year from 1945 to 1949. I'm Indy Neidell. Already before the Second World War, the U.S. decided to extend its opposition to colonialism from the Americas to the world at large. And when the war ends, they expect action. But they're also facing a mighty new foe as the Cold War begins, a communist bloc led by former ally Joseph Stalin and the USSR, and Mao Zedong opposing Chiang Kai-shek for rulership over China. The remaining European major colonial powers, Great Britain, France, and the Netherlands, are equally fearful of the communist surge. But they have no plans of their own to let go of their colonies. They successfully argue to the US that releasing those colonies will create a void in dominion in Asia that will surely be filled by Stalin and Mao. The US releases its last major colony in Asia, the Philippines, just after the war, and enters into a constructive alliance with that now independent nation. But instead of leaning on the European powers to do the same, as planned, they hesitate and reluctantly agree to reinstate the status quo of 1939. At the same time, the US, represented by President Harry Truman and former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, is also spearheading the transformation of the wartime anti-Axis alliance of the United Nations into a global body to create peace and stability. At the center of that effort is the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, granting all peoples the right to freedom, democracy, and self-determination. This is a position that is almost impossible to reconcile. One hand is maintaining Western domination, while the other is trying to give the world freedom and equal rights. And the people of the world want that badly enough that many are willing to go to war for it. I mean, isn't that what the global conflagration that just ended was about? A war to end tyranny, exploitation, chauvinism, and racial inequality? Already in the winter of 1945, it looks inevitable that the former Allied giants will face off with each other and with the peoples they hold in servitude in a violent showdown about the very principles they claim to defend. These two simultaneous conflicts, one between democracy versus communism and another about self-determination versus colonial servitude, will dominate the second half of the 20th century. This will lead to the betrayal of the ideas now being forged in the United Nations. It will turn the powers of the alliance against tyranny into the enforcers of what they claim to oppose. It will lead to proxy wars and violent independent struggles that will repeatedly put the world on the brink of another world war. And the first place where all of that will come together is the Dutch East Indies, a colonial dominion of the Kingdom of the Netherlands that now want to become the independent nation of Indonesia. It will be a bloody 4-year conflict fought by both sides with methods that can only be described as vicious, criminal, and contrary to human dignity and life. It is that conflict that we will cover in this series. But before we go there, we have to understand how and why this populous group of islands came under the control of the Dutch in the first place. Well, the why is actually pretty simple. Money. The region is 50 times the size of the Netherlands, and it's a cash cow, providing natural resources, cheap labor, and opportunity for enterprise without caring about the legal and social restraints of the homelands. And for that to be maintained, they need to keep the people subjugated and underdeveloped in what historians have described as a state of violence. For the how, we have to go all the way back to the 1500s, to the age of exploration. First, it is the European naval powerhouses, led by the kings of Spain and Portugal, that roam the seas, and the Ottoman Empire by land to expand their opportunities for resources and trade, most often through violent subjugation. After Queen Elizabeth defeats the Spanish Armada in 1588, the British and French crowns join this great game of global chess to set up trade networks and engage in the extremely lucrative European trade of spice, gold, silver, drugs, slaves, and more from faraway lands. In 1579, a coalition of, let's call them Dutch, states from the Low Countries in what is now Belgium and the Netherlands formed the 7 republics of the Netherlands to secede from the dominion of the Spanish crown during the 80 Years' War. No longer in the alliance of Spanish trade, they now take their own ships to the seas in pursuit of spices. See, spice trade is dominated by Portugal at this time, and when Portugal joins Spain in an Iberian Union, the Dutch access to that spice trade is shut off. So the Dutch hoist sails and establish their own trade routes. In 1602, modeled on the British idea of financing and promoting trade and discovery through cartels, the Dutch government supports the creation of the Dutch East India Trading Company, VOC, by a conglomerate of wealthy businessmen. It is granted a 21-year tax-free monopoly on Dutch overseas trade and the rights to establish settlements, sign treaties, and raise armies and fleets to wage war. The VOC soon establishes trading posts in Africa and Southeast Asia, often forcing out the British or Portuguese and brutally subduing local rulers. This develops into an economic, political, and military juggernaut, practically independent from the 7 republics. One of the areas of Dutch trade is a gigantic archipelago of over 17,000 islands between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, what the Europeans call the East Indies. This archipelago is dominated by 5 large islands: Sumatra, Java, Borneo, Sulawesi, and New Guinea. Although Western Europeans discover the East Indies in 1512, it has been continuously populated since prehistoric times. The archipelago is inhabited by a large, diverse population speaking hundreds of different languages, living in countless tribes, sultanates, and kingdoms. Situated at the maritime crossroads between India and China, it has long been a strategic trading and military position vied for by Indian, Chinese, and Southeast Asian interests. As a result, the islands are not only ethnically diverse, but also a patchwork of religions with major Hindu, Buddhist, and Muslim populations. While it is unclear exactly how Islam comes to the islands, it is believed to have arrived with Arab tradesmen sometime after the 9th century. By the 16th century, it has become a major religion on the islands of Sumatra, Java, and the Malay Peninsula. During the coming centuries, it will gradually become the dominant religion across the entire archipelago. Already in 1564, the Achenese Sultan, controlling a large part of northern Sumatra, gets military support through 22 warships sent by the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent to fight back the Portuguese Empire, who were trying to corner the lucrative trade of nutmeg, cloves, and cubeb pepper by military might. The Ottomans are successful, and Aceh is established as an independent Ottoman protectorate. With the Portuguese weakened, in the early 1600s, the Dutch, Spanish, French, and British begin establishing shared trade dominion over the region. What starts as trading ports and forts built to extend military influence develops into annexation and full appropriation of overseas territories. Lands, people, and resources are all taken for the benefit of the colonizer. If local leaders refuse to sign what are very unfavorable treaties, or if they resist, they are met with brute force. This only worsens as colonies are incorporated into European empires. See, the first wave of corporate colonialism that lasts well into the 18th century is followed by imperialist conquest with the establishment of colonies proper. The Crown of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, established in 1815, wants a slice of that pie as well. But the harsh competition for the lucrative trade in the East Indies has left the archipelago without a clear rule by any one of the European powers. The Netherlands are in large parts of Java and a number of trading ports, plantations, and some cities on the bigger islands, but they also have colonies in India and Africa, where Great Britain now wants to expand its empire. In 1824, the British and the Dutch enter into a treaty to divide between them dominion over South Asia and the East Indies. It is the beginning of a situation that will give Britain strong positions on the mainland, including India, Singapore, and Malaya. the Dutch will have the islands, and throughout the 19th century, they expand their territories in a series of bloody campaigns, drawing the borders of what is now Indonesia. The 1871 Anglo-Dutch Treaty of Sumatra gives the Dutch control of the entire maritime area, when the British yield their last positions on Java in exchange for the Dutch Gold Coast in Africa. Now, remember the Aceh Sultanate, the Ottoman Protectorate? With its lucrative pepper trade and oil resources, the Dutch soon get competition from American interests for influence over the Sultan of Aceh. When the Sultan starts expanding his interests in northern Sumatra southward, the Dutch decide to settle the issue with force in a series of campaigns that will be known as the Aceh War. From 1876 to 1904, the Dutch expansion takes on its most gruesome form. The Dutch army, under command of Johannes van Hoots, will now turn the Dutch East Indies into that state of violence. Led by Special Corps, the Corps Maréchaussée, things like torture, plundering, and collective punishment by mass murder for guerrilla resistance become common practice. To suppress even thoughts of further resistance, the Dutch expand this strategy of shock and awe to the entire Dutch East Indies. They will rely on fear to keep the Indonesians pacified. They justify this because of the cruel indigenous war practices and the uncivilized nature of the actions of Indonesian auxiliary troops in their own armies, which consist mainly of indigenous soldiers led by European officers. These expeditions to complete the Dutch East Indies kill around 120,000 Indonesians. But out of this terror, the Dutch East Indies, with borders roughly the same as modern Indonesia, are born. Now, though there is resistance to Dutch colonial rule on a regional or local level, there's no unified national ideal of Indonesian independence behind it at this point. But as the Dutch East Indies become one, nationalist movements start to spring up in Java and other places where Dutch influence is most noticeable. Following the First World War, ideas of decolonization grow in popularity worldwide. And Indonesians living and studying in the Netherlands start calling for the independence of their own nation. New youth organizations are founded across Indonesia in the 1920s and begin to imagine and to cultivate a united Indonesian identity, building a shared national character. They promote Javan and Indonesian culture, quickly forging the idea of a politically independent Indonesia, Indonesia Merdeka. This is cemented in a unified organization in 1926 with the first Indonesian Youth Congress. A flag, an anthem, and the language Bahasa are agreed on, as well as a unifying foundation of common desire, history, language, customary law, education, and the Scout movement. It is a generation under the age of 30 who are giving birth to the concept of an Indonesian nation-state. Perhaps ironically to the Dutch colonizers, they are a minority of youth that have gained access to Western education introduced by the Dutch in one of their rare attempts at positive reinforcement of colonial dominion. The students enter politics and found the Secular and Nationalist Party, the PNI, in 1928 and openly call for Indonesian independence. Their leader is Sukarno, a young architect who attended advanced Dutch schools on Java. Now, he is a charismatic figure, fluent in Dutch, Indonesian, Sundanese, Balinese, Japanese, Arabic, German, French, and English. For real. He attracts a large following among younger Indonesians. It does not take long, though, before the Dutch government cracks down on his movement's brazen expressions of anti-colonialism. You see, along with the nationalist movement, there are other Western concepts like socialism and communism driving anti-colonial spirit. In 1926, the Dutch use a failed communist uprising as an excuse to come down on independence movements across the board. Sukarno and other PNI figures are arrested in 1929 and sentenced to 4 years imprisonment, and nationalist language is strictly censored. But Sukarno uses his public trial as a platform to spread the nationalist message and to unmask the Dutch as colonial oppressors, transforming himself into a national hero. In a new anti-nationalist crackdown in 1934, the Dutch move to disable the entire movement. Sukarno is silently exiled to the island of Flores, along with the majority of the anti-imperialist leadership of nationalist parties. The Dutch succeed in this because the intellectual driving force behind the Indonesian national movement is fairly small. only a total of like 1,000 individuals get actual degrees from Indonesian universities by 1940, this also means that the movement is centered around Java and the big cities, and spread thinly throughout the sprawling archipelago. The nationalist sentiment is far from dead, though. In 1942, the Japanese invade as part of their war of expansion in the Pacific. With the Dutch suddenly out of the picture, those exiled leaders now get an unexpected chance to resume their quest for independence. Despite Japan also pursuing a racist, imperialist policy of conquest and subjugation, Indonesian national identity will further develop under Japanese rule, and once Japan has been defeated, that movement will sweep the islands like a tsunami. The Dutch reaction will launch a war in which the Dutch, the British, and the defeated Japanese will work together in a brutal fight against the Indonesian independence fighters, who themselves will resort to a bloodthirsty campaign of violent resistance. Although largely forgotten in 2020, this conflict will be the beginning of the end of the colonial era, and the first in a long series of bloody wars that will shape the second half of the 20th century. It will be a conflict that magnifies the issue of colonialism for world leaders. It will pit the Dutch against the US and the United Nations. It will bring the conflict between the Western nations and the growing communist bloc to Indonesia. It will cost tens of thousands of lives and will involve intimidation, kidnapping, torture, and mass murder. If you'd like to know more about how other nations attempted to rid themselves of their colonial yoke, you can click right here to see our Between Two Wars episode on the nationalist movements in the Middle East. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Terry Catapano. It is thanks to people like Terry that we're able to make this and all of our other programming. You can join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe and ring that bell. See you next time.